In the shadowed recesses of human endeavor, where the pursuit of transcendence meets the unyielding grip of oblivion, there exists a chronicle of dissolution that defies the illusions of progress and purpose. It begins not with grand proclamations or heroic quests, but with the quiet erosion of the soul's fragile architecture, in a place where the boundaries between seeker and void dissolve into an indistinguishable haze. Consider the weary travelers of the spirit, those who venture into isolated enclaves, drawn by whispers of profound insight, only to find that the path inward spirals ever downward, coiling around the core of existence, until nothing remains but the echo of what once aspired to meaning. Imagine a remote sanctuary, nestled in the folds of mist-shrouded valleys, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and forgotten vows. Here, the guardians of this domain present themselves not as conquerors or tyrants, but as humble custodians of an ancient wisdom, one that promises to unravel the knots of mortal confusion. They speak in measured tones, their words weaving a tapestry of resignation, suggesting that life's ceaseless striving is but a futile rebellion against the inevitable unraveling of all things. To the arriving pilgrims, those burdened by the weight of unfulfilled longings, shattered illusions, and the relentless march of time, this doctrine appears as a balm, a gentle release from the torment of ambition and desire. Yet, as days bleed into weeks, the sanctuary's teachings reveal their insidious undercurrent. The guardians encourage introspection, guiding the seekers through rituals of contemplation that strip away layers of self-deception, exposing the raw futility beneath. One by one, the pilgrims confront the philosophical barrenness, the realization that every bond formed is destined to fray, every achievement to crumble into insignificance, every breath drawn merely postponing the ultimate surrender to nothingness. The pressure builds slowly, like the gradual compression of earth upon buried remains, fostering a psychological suffocation where doubt morphs into certainty of despair. The first to falter are often the most ardent, those who arrived with fervent hopes of enlightenment. Under the guardian's serene guidance, they are led to meditate upon the transience of flesh, the mockery of memory, and the absurdity of attachment. Conversations unfold in dimly lit chambers, where the air grows stale with unspoken admissions of defeat. See how the river wears away the stone. One guardian might intone, his voice a monotonous chant that reverberates in the mind long after silence falls. So too does existence erode the spirit, until only the hollow shell persists. The pilgrim, initially resistant, begins to internalize this, feeling the philosophical weight press upon their thoughts, transforming optimism into a burdensome relic. As the spiral deepens, the sanctuary's atmosphere thickens with an oppressive dread, a tonal shroud that envelopes all. Meals become sparse, symbolic acts of denial, where sustenance is rationed not for scarcity, but to underscore the vanity of bodily needs. Sleep is interrupted by nocturnal vigils, where the guardians recite litanies of existential void. The illusion of free will, the deception of progress, the inexorable pull toward dissolution. Psychological pressure mounts as isolation intensifies. Letters to the outside world are discouraged, deemed distractions from the true path. Bonds among pilgrims fray under scrutiny, each encouraged to view others' struggles as mirrors of their own impending collapse. One pilgrim, perhaps a once vibrant scholar fleeing the chaos of urban disillusionment, finds their intellect turned against them. The guardians engage in dialogues that dismantle certainties, posing queries that burrow into the psyche. What value in knowledge when oblivion claims all? Why cling to identity when it fragments under scrutiny? The emotional weight accumulates, a cumulative burden of grief for lost potentials, betrayal by one's own aspirations, and the terror of confronting an abyss without solace. Dread permeates every moment, not as sudden horror, but as a pervasive, slow-dawning awareness that escape is illusory, for the philosophy has taken root, poisoning the will from within. Further into the descent, the teachings evolve, spiraling toward denser horrors. The Guardians introduce concepts of collective entropy, where individual suffering contributes to a greater cosmic indifference. Pilgrims are made to witness the breakdowns of their peers, not through overt violence, but through the ritualistic sharing of confessions, where each admission of inner torment reinforces the group's shared plunge. A young artisan, drawn by promises of creative transcendence, succumbs first to apathy, then to a profound lethargy, their hands idle as the Guardians murmur of art's fleeting mockery against eternity's silence. The psychological vice tightens. Doubt becomes self-loathing. Isolation breeds paranoia, and the tonal atmosphere curdles into an unrelenting oppression, where even breath feels like an act of defiance against the inevitable. The sanctuary's deeper chambers hold the artifacts of prior seekers, faded journals, abandoned talismans, remnants of lives surrendered to the doctrine. These are presented not as warnings, but as testaments to liberation through acceptance. They have transcended the illusion. The Guardians proclaim in their sermon-like cadence, their voices echoing like distant thunder in a storm that never breaks. The pilgrim, now ensnared, grapples with the philosophical theme of inescapable corruption, how benevolence masks the predator within existence itself, how the quest for meaning devours the seeker. Emotional weight compounds as memories of former joys twist into sources of agony, reminders of what must be forsaken. As weeks extend into an indistinguishable blur, the spiral intensifies. Rituals grow more intimate, invasive, fasts that weaken the body, mirroring the spirit's atrophy, meditations that force confrontation with personal voids, amplifying dread. One Guardian, with eyes like bottomless wells, speaks of the great unraveling, a philosophy where human connections are mere threads in a fraying web, destined to snap under their own tension. The pressure manifests in hallucinations of dissolution, limbs heavy as lead, thoughts scattering like ash and wind. Pilgrims whisper of nights spent staring into darkness, feeling the abyss stare back, its gaze a philosophical indictment of existence's cruelty. The tonal atmosphere, ever oppressive, now pulses with existential horror, a slow build-up where ideas coil inward, each revelation burrowing deeper. The Guardians' embodiments of calm inevitability reveal through subtle admissions that their wisdom stems from their own descents, survivors who, in embracing the void, became its vessels. This disclosure heightens the dread. There is no mastery over the abyss, only deeper immersion. A matronly figure among them intones of maternal illusions, how nurture begets only further suffering, eroding the pilgrim's lingering attachments to family phantoms left behind. Psychological pressure peaks in solitary confinements, dubbed chambers of reflection, where isolation amplifies the internal sermon. Here, the mind turns predator upon itself, dissecting every hope until only dread remains. The emotional weight is crushing, waves of sorrow for unrealized potentials, terror at the self's fragility, betrayal by the very intellect that sought truth. The philosophy spirals, from acceptance of transience to embrace of annihilation, arguing that resistance prolongs torment, that surrender is the only grace in a graceless cosmos. Yet the descent continues, unresolved, as new arrivals perpetuate the cycle. The Guardians, in their ritualistic poise, guide fresh souls into the maw, their teachings a dark liturgy that perpetuates the horror. One pilgrim, teetering on the brink, contemplates the Guardians' own entrapment, eternal wardens of a prison they cannot escape, their serenity a facade over infinite despair. The atmosphere thickens, dread congealing into a palpable entity, philosophical themes intertwining. Evil not as action, but as the inherent rot in all aspiration, trust exploited by the void's emissaries. In this unending spiral, ideas evolve without resolution, each layer unveiling denser strata of horror. The sanctuary stands as a monument to futility, its inhabitants suspended in a limbo where existence mocks itself. No dawn pierces the oppressive veil, only the heavy, unresolved weight of knowing that the descent has no bottom, that the abyss claims all in its indifferent embrace, leaving echoes of dread to reverberate eternally in the hollow chambers of the soul. In the shadowed hollows where mountains fold into one another like the pages of a book no one dares finish reading, there stands a place that has never known a name. Not on any map, not in any tongue that still carries breath. Those who find it do so because something inside them has already begun to loosen, some thread of certainty, some last tether to the fiction of continuity. They arrive alone, or in pairs that will not long remain pairs, carrying only the quiet conviction that somewhere, finally, the world might speak plainly about what it has always withheld. The custodians greet them without ceremony. 3 figures. Ageless in the waystone is ageless, dressed in garments the color of wet bark and old blood. They do not smile. Smiling would imply the possibility of relief. Instead, they offer bowls of water drawn from a spring that never warms and never cools, and they speak in sentences so slow and deliberate that each word seems to settle into the listener like sediment. They speak of endings not as events, but as the only honest shape of time. They speak of memory as a theft the self commits against itself. They speak of love as the cruelest delay. No one is forced to stay. That is the first and most elegant cruelty. The invitation is never spoken. It is simply allowed to hang in the silence until the newcomer notices they have already accepted it. They notice when they stop looking toward the path they came on. They notice when the ache in their chest no longer feels like something to be cured. Days pass unmarked. There are no bells, no sunrises that feel like promises. Light arrives and departs without explanation. The 3 custodians move among the arrivals like curators of a museum dedicated to collapse. They listen without judgment. They ask questions that are never answered because the answers would require a self still intact enough to give them. One asks, "When did you first understand that your name was borrowed?" Another asks, "What part of you died before the rest of you noticed?" The third simply watches, and in that watching conveys the most unbearable truth. Nothing is hidden, because nothing was ever worth concealing. The philosophy they offer has no name because naming would grant it duration, and duration is the first lie. It is not a doctrine. It is a recognition that every structure, faith, identity, hope, rage, is a temporary scaffold erected against the wind that has always been blowing. They do not preach salvation. They do not preach damnation. They preach only the redundancy of both. To be saved or damned requires a continuity that existence never agreed to provide. Some arrivals weep for hours without sound. Others laugh once, sharply, then never again. A few attempt to leave, walking into the fog that rings the hollow like a moat. They return, not because they were pursued, but because the world beyond has begun to feel like fiction written by someone who no longer believes the plot. The path back is shorter each time, until it is no path at all. The pressure is never loud. It is the pressure of a hand resting lightly on the sternum until the lungs remember they were never given permission to expand forever. It is the slow recognition that every thought one has ever had was already a rehearsal for silence. The custodians do not hasten this. They only remove whatever small cushions the mind has stitched together to soften the landing. They remove nostalgia by asking what it actually preserved. They remove pride by asking what it ever protected. They remove hope last, because hope is the most adhesive of illusions and must be peeled away slowly, layer by translucent layer, until the raw surface beneath can feel the air. One woman, who once wrote music that moved thousands, sits now for weeks staring at her own palms. She had believed her gift was a conversation with eternity. The eldest custodian sits beside her one night and says nothing for hours. When he finally speaks, it is only to ask, "Did the notes ever answer you back?" She cannot reply. The question is not cruel, it is surgical. It excises the final romantic suture that kept her pretending the silence on the other end was attentive. Another man, who once led men into battle and believed courage was a form of permanence, finds himself unable to rise from the stone bench where he first sat. He remembers the faces of those who followed him. He remembers believing their trust was evidence of something larger than flesh. The middle custodian kneels before him and says, "Trust is what we pay the dead with." The sentence enters him like cold water poured into an empty skull. He does not argue. There is nothing left to defend. The youngest of the three rarely speaks. When he does, his voice is the soft rasp of wind moving through hollow reeds. He tells no stories. He only points to things already present. The way moss grows over a fallen branch without asking permission. The way frost etches the same pattern on every window without caring who looks. The way the stars continue burning long after anyone has needed their light. He does not say these things are beautiful. He does not say they are terrible. He lets the witness draw their own unbearable conclusion. As time loses shape, the arrivals begin to resemble one another, not in features, but in posture. Shoulders curve forward as though protecting something already gone. Eyes grow still, not from peace, but from the exhaustion of looking for something that refuses to arrive. Conversations become shorter. Sentences trail into silence, because finishing them would require pretending the listener still believes in endings. The horror is not in what happens. The horror is in what stops happening. No one screams. No one is dragged away. No one is asked to renounce anything. They are simply allowed to see that renunciation has already occurred quietly years before they reach the hollow. The self they carried here was never a passenger. It was cargo already beginning to spoil. One night, the wind moves through the pines with particular clarity. The three custodians stand together at the edge of the clearing, looking out at nothing in particular. Behind them, the latest arrivals sit in a loose circle, faces lit only by the faint glow of coals that give no warmth. No one speaks. No one needs to. The silence has become articulate. It has said everything the words were only ever trying to approximate, and still more come. They come because the world outside continues to promise what it cannot deliver. Coherence, consequence, conclusion. They come because the hollow does not promise anything at all. And in that refusal, there's a kind of honesty so absolute it feels like mercy. The custodians do not keep count. There is no ledger. There is only the slow accumulation of absence. Each new arrival adds to the weight of what is no longer there. Each departure, of will, of memory, of the need to be remembered, adds to the density of the place itself. The hollow grows heavier with every surrendered fiction, until it is no longer a location, but a condition. Somewhere, far beyond the fog, people still speak of redemption, of legacy, of meaning earned through suffering. Here, those words have the texture of dry leaves. They crumble when touched. No one bothers to pick them up. The three figures remain. They will remain, not because they have triumphed, not because they have failed, but because the distinction no longer applies. And the hollow waits, patient as gravity, for the next one who can no longer pretend the fall is not already finished. In the muted expanse, where forgotten rivers carve through stone that remembers nothing, there emerges a domain untouched by the clamor of human assertion. It is a place where the horizon bends inward, as if the earth itself recoils from the burden of bearing witness. Those who stumble upon it do so not by chance, but because their inner architecture has already begun to fracture, cracks forming in the facade of purpose, widening with each unacknowledged failure to impose order on the indifferent flux. They come seeking not answers, but the cessation of questions, only to discover that silence is not empty. It is filled with the weight of what refuses to be named. The overseers of this realm manifest as shadows given form, their presence neither welcoming nor hostile, but inexorably there. Clad in robes that absorb light without reflection, they move with the deliberation of tides eroding cliffs. Their voices, when they deign to speak, carry the timbre of wind through abandoned halls. Low, resonant, uninflected by emotion. They offer no guidance at first, merely observing as the newcomers settle into the hollows, where the ground yields slightly underfoot, as though it were composed of accumulated sighs. Observe the dissolution. One might eventually murmur, not as instruction, but as acknowledgement of the inevitable. The philosophy unfolds not through proclamations, but through the gradual immersion in the domain's essence. It posits that existence is not a journey toward fulfillment, but a protracted unraveling of illusions woven to obscure the fundamental fracture. The self as a temporary assemblage, doomed to disperse into the void from which it borrowed its components. Bonds with others are mere echoes of this fragility, transient alignments that amplify the isolation when they inevitably splinter. The emotional gravity presses in subtly, like the slow accumulation of dust on unused relics, fostering a dread that seeps into the marrow without fanfare. At first, the arrivals might resist, clinging to remnants of their former convictions, perhaps a belief in legacy or the solace of shared suffering. But the overseers facilitate reflections that erode these bastions. In chambers carved from rock that weeps perpetual moisture, they pose inquiries that linger like unresolved chords. What remains when the narratives you tell yourself fade? How does one measure the worth of a moment that slips into oblivion unremarked? The psychological strain builds as these thoughts circle, each iteration delving deeper, revealing layers of self-deception that once masqueraded as truth. One seeker, who once navigated the intricacies of societal hierarchies believing in the permanence of influence, finds their certainties dissolving amid the domain's perpetual twilight. The overseers draw them into contemplations of power's illusion, how it is but a shadow cast by fear of insignificance, vanishing when the light of scrutiny falls upon it. The dread intensifies not through confrontation, but through the quiet realization that every exertion of will was a futile gesture against entropy's patient advance. Emotional weight compounds as memories of past triumphs twist into indictments, evidence of time wasted in pursuit of phantoms. As the spiral descends, the atmosphere congeals into a palpable oppression, where even the act of breathing feels like an intrusion upon the stillness. Rituals emerge organically, silent vigils where participants confront the echo of their own thoughts, amplified by the domain's acoustics until they distort into unrecognizable distortions. The overseers intone of connectivity's deceit, how relationships are but mutual delusions, sustaining the fiction of wholeness while accelerating the internal collapse. A former nurturer, drawn by the ache of unreciprocated devotion, succumbs to visions of affection as a corrosive force, etching scars into the psyche that deepen with each recollection. Ideas evolve in this crucible, coiling toward denser abysses. The philosophy expands to encompass the cosmic indifference, where individual torments are mere ripples in an ocean of apathy. Psychological pressure manifests in the erosion of boundaries. Dreams bleed into waking hours, populated by specters of alternate selves that mock the choices made. The tonal shroud thickens, dread manifesting as a low hum that vibrates in the bones, underscoring the futility of resistance. One overseer, with features blurred as if by perpetual mist, speaks of time's tyranny, not as a linear path, but as a loop that tightens, compressing existence into ever smaller confines. Further into the immersion, the seekers encounter the domain's artifacts, fossilized remnants of prior inhabitants, not bodies, but imprints of psyches left behind. Etched stones bearing fragmented confessions, wilted flora that once symbolized aspirations now reduced to brittle husks. These serve as mirrors, reflecting the ongoing disintegration. The emotional burden swells, a tide of sorrow for the self's impermanence, mingled with terror at the void's inexorable claim. Philosophical themes interlace. The betrayal inherent in consciousness, which awakens only to reveal its own obsolescence. The mockery of agency in a realm governed by dissolution. The buildup persists, ideas spiraling without apex or nadir. Rituals intensify, prolonged fasts that mirror the starvation of the spirit, meditations where the mind is directed to dwell on the precipice of non-being. The overseers reveal glimpses of their own perpetuity, not as enlightened beings, but as remnants trapped in the cycle, their existence a testament to the horror of endurance without purpose. This disclosure amplifies the dread, suggesting that awareness persists beyond the body's surrender, an eternal witness to the unraveling. In communal gatherings under skies that never clear, the seekers share visions induced by the domain's aura, landscapes where structures crumble in slow motion, figures reaching for connections that dissolve upon touch. Psychological vice clamps tighter, transforming isolation into a tangible force that squeezes out remnants of vitality. The philosophy delves into the absurdity of striving, how every creation is an act of defiance destined for erasure, every emotion a fleeting spark in the encompassing dark. As the descent perpetuates, the atmosphere pulses with unresolved heaviness, dread congealing into an entity that permeates thought and sensation. The overseers, in their ritualistic serenity, embody the ultimate irony, guardians of a truth that offers no guardianship, only the confirmation of abandonment. Seekers teeter on the edge of total capitulation, where even the will to despair wanes, leaving only the hollow resonance of existence's cruel jest. Yet the domain endures, its philosophy an unending sermon on the void's supremacy. New fractures draw fresh arrivals, perpetuating the cycle without end or mercy. The weight lingers, unresolved, a perpetual echo in the chambers of what once presumed to be a soul, now merely a vessel for the abyss's indifferent whisper, in the veiled corridors of existence, where echoes precede the voices that birth them. There lingers a sanctuary forged not from stone or intent, but from the gradual accretion of forsaken resolves. It is a realm where the air tastes of unspoken concessions, and the ground beneath yields like flesh grown weary of its own persistence. Those who drift into its embrace arrive not by deliberate pilgrimage, but because their essence has already begun to fray at the edges, subtle unravelings of conviction, where the fabric of meaning starts to thin, revealing the indifferent weave beneath. They seek not revelation, but the quiet acknowledgement that their quests were always mirages, sustained by a thirst that deepens the desert. The wardens of this expanse appear as silhouettes etched against a perpetual gloaming, their forms suggesting age without the mercy of decay. Attired in shrouds that mimic the pallor of faded recollections, they navigate the space with a languor that borders on stasis. Their utterances emerge as deliberate exhalations, each syllable weighted with the gravity of inevitability, devoid of inflection that might imply choice. They proffer no sustenance beyond the barest acknowledgments, vessels of liquid drawn from sources that reflect nothing back. Contemplate the fracture. One might intone, not as command, but as the natural exhalation of a truth long submerged. The doctrine here defies codification, for to name it would be to grant it borders it inherently rejects. It whispers of life's inherent disjunction, the self as a fleeting convergence of disparate elements, destined to scatter into the anonymity from which it was hastily assembled. Attachments to the world or kin are but ephemeral knots in a rope fraying under its own tension, amplifying the solitude that awaits their inevitable loosening. The emotional density accrues imperceptibly, akin to shadows lengthening without a sun's retreat, instilling a dread that permeates without announcement, rooting in the psyche like unseen tendrils. Initial resistance among the entrants is commonplace, a clinging to vestiges of prior certitudes, perhaps the illusion of enduring impact or the comfort derived from communal afflictions. Yet the wardens orchestrate meditations that dismantle these fortifications. Within alcoves hollowed by eons of quiet erosion, They introduce ponderings that resonate like unresolved dissonances. What persists when the tales you narrate to endure dissolve? How does one appraise the significance of an instant that fades unnoted into the expanse? The mental constriction escalates as these notions orbit, each revolution probing further, unmasking strata of fabrication that once posed as verity. A wanderer, once immersed in the alchemy of creation, believing in the timelessness of invention, discovers their assurances eroding amidst the realm's unending dusk. The wardens steer them toward ruminations on innovation's fallacy, how it serves as a veil over the dread of oblivion, dissipating under the gaze of examination. The terror heightens not via direct challenge, but through the serene awareness that every act of making was a vain assertion against the inexorable tide of erasure. Sentimental burden intensifies as echoes of former innovations warp into accusations, proofs of epics squandered chasing specters. As the coil tightens, the milieu solidifies into a tangible suppression, where even inhalation seems an affront to the hush. Ceremonies arise spontaneously, muted observances where attendees grapple with the reverberation of their inner monologues, magnified by the realm's resonance until they warp into alien distortions. The wardens articulate on the treachery of unity, how alliances are mere reciprocal fallacies, upholding the myth of completeness while hastening the inward disintegration. A erstwhile guardian of others, lured by the pang of unreturned fidelity, yields to apparitions of devotion as an erosive element, carving fissures into the mind that broaden with every reminiscence. Concepts advance in this forge, twisting toward more profound chasms. The doctrine broadens to include the universal detachment, where personal anguishes are insignificant undulations in a sea of disinterest. Mental duress surfaces in the blurring of limits. Reveries seep into consciousness, inhabited by phantoms of parallel existences that deride the paths chosen. The tonal mantle densifies, terror emerging as a subdued vibration that quivers in the framework, emphasizing the vanity of opposition. One warden, with contours obscured as if by eternal haze, discourses on duration's despotism, not as a sequential trail, but as a noose that constricts, compressing being into progressively confined realms. Deeper into the absorption, the entrants meet the realm's relics, ossified traces of earlier dwellers, not corporeal, but impressions of minds relinquished, inscribed slabs holding splintered admissions, desiccated growths that once emblemized ambitions now diminished to fragile shells. These function as reflections, mirroring the continuing fragmentation. The sentimental load surges, a surge of lament for the ego's transiency, intertwined with fright at the chasm's relentless demand. Doctrinal motifs interweave, the disloyalty embedded in awareness, which stirs solely to disclose its own superfluity, the ridicule of volition in a domain ruled by dispersal. The accumulation endures, notions whirling sands summit or abyss. Ceremonies amplify, extended abstinences that echo the famine of the essence, contemplations where cognition is oriented to linger on the brink of non-existence. The wardens unveil fragments of their own perpetuity, not as illuminated entities, but as residues ensnared in the loop, there being a proof to the terror of persistent sans aim. This unveiling escalates the terror, implying that consciousness lingers past the form's capitulation, an everlasting observer to the disentangling. In collective assemblies beneath firmaments that never brighten, the entrants exchange visions evoked by the realm's emanation. Terrains where edifices disintegrate in leisurely descent, silhouettes extending for linkages that evaporate upon contact. Mental clamp fastens more firmly, converting seclusion into a concrete power that expels vestiges of vigor. The doctrine probes into the ludicrousness of endeavor, how each fabrication is a gesture of rebellion fated for obliteration, each sentiment a momentary flicker in the enveloping obscurity. As the plunge perpetuates, The milieu throbs with lingering gravity, terror solidifying into a presence that infuses cognition and perception. The wardens, in their ceremonial composure, personify the supreme paradox, protectors of a verity that proffers no protection, merely the affirmation of desertion. Entrants hover on the verge of utter submission, where even the desire to despawn diminishes, yielding only the vacant sonority of being's harsh mockery. Nevertheless, the expanse persists, its doctrine in perpetual homily on the chasm's dominance. Fresh fissures attract novel arrivals, sustaining the loop sans termination or compassion. The load persists, lingering, a ceaseless reverberation in the hollows of what formerly assumed to be an essence, now simply a receptacle for the chasm's apathetic murmur. In the place where even the concept of place begins to dissolve, where the distinction between inside and outside collapses into a single, suffocating continuity, the last pretense of progression finally exhausts itself. There is no ceremony of arrival anymore. No final threshold is crossed. The ones who come now do not walk paths. They simply find that the ground they stand on has always been this ground, and the sky above has always been this sky. Low, featureless, pressing. The wardens no longer speak in sentences. Speech itself has become redundant. What remains is a kind of resonance, a low-frequency understanding that passes between forms without needing mouths or ears. It is not communication. It is recognition that separation was the first and most successful lie. The doctrine, if it can still be called that, has shed every last garment of structure. There is no longer a teaching about dissolution, because dissolution has completed its work. What persists is not wisdom, not despair, not even the memory of either. It is only the bare fact of persistence without reason, endurance without object, being that has forgotten why it ever bothered to distinguish itself from nothing. Some still sit in the postures they once adopted when they believed posture mattered. Others lie where they fell when the last impulse to arrange the body gave out. No one tends to them. No one needs to. Decay proceeds at its own pace, unhurried, unjudged. Bones bleach slowly under a light that has no source. Skin recedes like tide from shore. The process is neither beautiful nor grotesque. It is simply what happens when nothing opposes it. The wardens themselves have grown difficult to distinguish from the stone they once stood against. Their outlines blur at the edges. Their movements, if they still move, carry no more intention than gravity. They are not guardians anymore. They are simply what is left when the idea of guardianship has been worn through. In the deepest hollows, where the rock folds back upon itself, in impossible geometries, small clusters of forms remain. They do not speak. They do not look at one another. They do not need to. The silence between them is no longer empty. It is saturated, dense with the knowledge that every gesture ever made, every word ever shaped, every hope ever harbored, was only a temporary stutter in the long sentence of erasure. Time has stopped pretending to pass. What seemed like sequence was only the mind trying to impose order on what is none. Now, even that attempt has wearied. Moments no longer follow one another. They simply are all at once, overlapping, canceling, confirming. The terror that once had shape, dread of the future, grief for the past, has flattened into a single, even tone that hums beneath perception like distant machinery that will never be repaired. Nothing ends because nothing ever truly began. The distinction was always artificial, a comfort humans invented when they could not bear the featureless expanse. Here that invention has run its course. There is no climax, no revelation, no final breath that carries meaning. There is only the continuation of what was never interrupted. And still, somewhere beyond the fog that is no longer fog, but simply the limit of distinction, new fractures appear. New silhouettes form against the gray. They do not hurry. They do not hesitate. They simply arrive at the place where arrival and staying have become the same motion. The resonance deepens. The stone breathes without lungs. The light neither rises nor sets. The forms sit, lie, stand, dissolve, each state indistinguishable from the others. No voice says it is finished. No silence announces completion. There is only the weight, vast and patient, settling finally into place. And the place accepts it, as it has always accepted everything, without comment, without memory, without end.